Hi everybody, how you doing? Everyone okay? Good. Hi everybody out there. Week 8, midterm. I'm sure you're delighted that there's no midterm exam. Woo. Instead, you've got a nice, great big data analysis to do. That's okay. All right. So I just wanted to remind you of what's due next week. You have an assignment on box to put it up in. I just had a conversation with Nana, who reminded me that some things like the overlap signal, where you're trying to do the latch or the overlap, can be tricky to do on the computer. So it's fine by me if you do it and then put in the latch mark by hand or the overlap mark by hand and then make me a PDF. That's fine, because I understand that some of those markings are complicated. So if you want to do that, do that. Don't PDF your whole assignment though, because then I can't give you any you know, feedback, because I can't write anything on a PDF. But if you want to PDF your transcription, your accompanying transcription with the latches and the whatever, remember that your transcription will have line numbers. So I won't be writing anything necessarily directly on your transcription. I'll say line 3, line 4, or whatever. So it should come to me as the analysis should come to me in a doc form so that I can write feedback. But the appendix with your transcription on can be as a PDF. Does that make sense? Okay, great. If anybody has any questions, let me know. Does anyone have any questions at this time about the second, apart from that one, which was an excellent one? No?
I have a little question. So for the non-native speakers, do they both have to be the same variety or the same thing?
Nope. Nope. They can be anyone you want. They can be anyone you want. All right. Sorry, just let me find my textbook. Okay. Okay. So next. Oh, you never sent me the thing, did you?
No, I didn't.
It's okay. So your reading posts were really super interesting, and I enjoyed them. You'll remember that what you were writing about was a sort of two people getting into it. Michael Hoey, who was the guy that had this quite complicated idea of lexical cohesion, and my advisor, actually, Andrea Tyler, who was at Georgetown University, who said, I don't think this works. And one of the reasons I wanted you to do this is for you to see how that works in the field when you know, I mean, obviously you don't slam each other just for the hell of it, but, you know, you can, if you read something and you say, wait, you know, then you can engage that topic. And so the one thing he was saying at that time was that because the links between 1, 2, 4, and 5 were strong, that they were good, and that because 3 was not strong in terms of links, many wild bears have become garbage junkies feeding from dumps around human development. So it didn't have enough of those lexical links, that it was not strongly coherent with the rest of the text, right? So so then I just put up a few things that people wrote. So Mimi had said, according to Hoey's analysis, since sentence 3 had few lexical bonds, sorry, that's what I meant to say, bonds, not links, it could be removed from the main text without disrupting the coherence. And then what Tyler had argued was that it's sentence 3 that actually holds the text together, because it adds 2 important pieces of information to the interpretation, that some of the bears like human food and therefore can be potentially dangerous. So that was good. And then we had two other comments I added of people that had written what it was that Andrea Tyler said. So Drew said, to summarize it best as I can, Hoey makes mistakes in observation with causation. So the fact that you've got lexical repetition is not what makes it coherent. A coherent text may demonstrate lexical repetition, but as we've seen several times, we'll see again today, that lexical repetition has to be of a certain kind, right? So this is what Tyler was saying. And in fact, she then goes on to show that coherent text, both with low and with high repetition, can be coherent. And she does that through her analysis, which Matthew and Austin talked about. I mean, you all talked about it, but I just took a few examples. Her second analysis focused on the native speaker and the non-native speaker that taught a similar math lesson. And although the non-native speaker used more lexical repetition than the native speaker, 3 different professors judged his lecture as being more difficult, right? And part of that was, the problem was the kind of repetition that was going in there, right? The problem was that the kind of repetition that the non-native speaker was doing was stuff that the students already knew. So in fact, it was just sort of adding to weight, you know, it was old information. And so now they start getting confused, right? Well, why are we still going over this stuff again? Is that no longer old information? Or, you know, whereas the native speaker was building coherence on a knowledge base that he already knew that they had, right? So here is a term that we're going to come up with a lot with coherence. Tyler notes that the NS non-native speaker have more repetition, but wrongly assumed the schema of the student. In other words, if you wrongly assume what your students or your hero is coming with, then all the repetition in the world doesn't necessarily make it less complicated. In fact, it's highly likely to make it more complicated, right? Now, Mimi also found, I can't put up here now, but tell us about your findings. Tell us loudly so that everyone can hear it in out there too.
So I found Howey's 2005 book, which is called Lexical Priming, and in it, he still backs up his theory from 1991 on lexical repetition being related to coherence, but this time he actually uses it with corpus linguistics. So he has data from different sources to back up his theory. And I just found out that the part where he talks about his theory, the repetition being like the sentence 3, being taken out and it not affecting the coherence, was actually a different person who wrote a review on the book and said referring to Tyler's critique.
Oh, interesting. Interesting.
That, Tyler was her critique was not really fair.
It was mistaken, right? Because he never said that. Somebody else said that about his stuff.
Right.
Interesting.
So,
interesting way to get around it.
Right.
That's good.
So
yeah.
I can send y'all the review of that book, and so all she's saying is that until I hear or she,
who? Hoey?
Reviewer.
I don't know.
So she talks about the fact that where Tyler's coming from is that it's affecting the meaning of the paper.
Right.
She's saying that by taking the sentence out, it actually affects the meaning of the paper, in that sentence is what gives us more information about the bears.
Right.
But Hoey is not saying per se that it affects the meaning. She's saying it affects the coherence of it. So
right. He.
They're both.
Yeah, right,
I'm sorry. He.
Yeah.
So they're both right in a sense. But
so this is even more interesting to me. I mean, this is one of the little paths that you go down when you find something that you're interested in investigating. that you learn, you know, who did this and who did that and who said this and who assumed that, and you know, I find it all very interesting. There's a book actually called Controversies in Applied Linguistics by Barbara Seidelhofer that's awesome, and that I have that really takes much bigger things than this. I mean, this was interesting. This was a conference presentation originally, though, that Andy did, but takes huge things like two clashing paradigms, like the world English paradigm versus the English will fall apart if we let the world have it. We should be sticking to traditional varieties, you know, and so these big, enormous issues that researchers have gone backwards and forwards with each other in print over, and she redoes these in print. It's really interesting. Yeah. Okay, good. So well done, everybody. I hope you enjoyed it. And also looking at the texts that Andy gave you of the ITAs was interesting. So how do texts hold together is what we're talking about. There's a difference between a text and a collection of sentences, right? And so last week we focused very specifically on cohesion, surface structure elements. And this week we're going to add discussion of coherence, which is basically overall meaning in context, right? So another way you can think about it is frames, scripts, or schemas. Like essentially what happens is when a discourse text starts, doesn't matter whether it's a spoken or a written text, you as a receiver of that text trigger certain things like, oh, this is a weather forecast, thus I will expect this organizational structure, or this is a news bulletin, thus I will expect. This triggers what we call a script or a schema in your head, and you are now ready to interpret that piece of text or discourse. And so nothing comes without this notion of interpretation. So the question is, can we demonstrate that organizational structure? Like, how can we bring to light what it is that we know that we're thinking about? And of course, also for us, is it universal or culturally specific? And I think, you know, we can all say quite clearly that it's culturally specific, right? You only have to watch a Bollywood movie to see that, you know, and not be a Bollywood Indian moviegoer to work out that it's culturally specific, because I have no idea what's about to happen or why. And when it ends, I'm like, that was the end. So yeah, so we can pretty clear. So the question is, what's going on? What are these structures? How can they help us as linguists and teachers? So the cohesion is the surface elements. The coherence is the overall meaning of the text, what it is about, and it is achieved by fulfilling expectations of the text. That's what I just said, right? If it's a news broadcast, it fulfills your expectations of what a news broadcast is. Any implicatures or inferences or any common world knowledge about what should be happening are all caught up in these scripts or schemas that you expect. So one of the most common and well-known ideas of coherent structure is William Lebov's narrative structure, which your book went into. So if you look at page 123 to 127, we're not going to go through it piece by piece, but that's where it is. And so after we've had this discussion, if you weren't sure about some of this, you can go back and have a look. But it's one of the most famous linguistic studies of how we show what a coherent narrative is. So he had what he called natural narratives, which means not once upon a time stories, but stories that you tell each other, right? And he identified 6 common elements that form structures of a well-developed narrative. What that means is if they don't appear, then that might be one of the reasons why you say, well, that was a terrible story, right? Because parts of this expectation of what a good story is are not being fulfilled. So it starts with an abstract. So in this case, what was the abstract in the example from the book? Was it the abstract, I went on a hunting trip or something? I had a hell of a hunting trip. Wasn't that this one?
Had a hell of a camping trip.
Had a hell of a camping trip. Okay, so that sets up, and in this case, in my example, I remember when my family went on vacation to the beach. Okay, so that sort of sets it up that you're gonna, you know, hopefully what happens at that point is people stop talking and let you, you know, because you're cueing a narrative, right? So then the next one is the orientation. So the who, when, why, and where, right? Which is usually in the past tense, right? And often in the past continuous, right? So what is it in the camping trip one?
John and I.
John and I.
And a million miles from nowhere.
Yep.
And 2 or 3 years ago.
Yeah, okay, good. So the past, right. So my sister and I were walking along the shore and collecting shells, okay? And then the next one is your complicating action, which in this case is in the past tense, but is often actually in the present tense because it's action, I was about to say action again, but you know, it's the real plot, you know, it's the exciting part, right? So it's just as, now what is it in your book? Is it in the past tense or the present tense? For the complicating action. Can we find any complicating action? Are we struggling to find complicating action? So we got up that morning, we're in our camp class, basically didn't want to, we were fixing coffee over the campfire, and I happened to look up out across this field at the edge, and about 300 yards out is this 6-buck deer, right? So he's shifted to simple present, right, or what's called historical present, okay, which often happens with complicating actions. So with the one I have here, you could say, so we were walking along the shore and collecting shells. Suddenly, we see this swimmer waving his hands in the air and he's calling out for help. This rip current is pulling him out to sea. So we run down the beach. You know, you could just as easily do this whole complicating action in present tense. And a lot of people think that's more convincing. Right, it's more dramatic, you know, to have your complicating action in present tense. And then a resolution. So what happened in which the problem posed by the complicating action comes to a conclusion. So the lifeguard paddled out on his surfboard and rescued the swimmer. Again, can be in historical present. So the lifeguard paddles out on his surfboard and rescues the guy, right? And then the coda returns the listener back out of the story, okay? So, and we all lived happily ever after, or, you know, we saw the guy later and he was fine, you know, or we, you know, something like that, okay? And then at the end, but also at various points, which your book shows you, you can evaluate at various different points, you have this sort of optional idea of an evaluation. And that's basically to say, you know, this is why I'm telling you this story. This is why it's a good story. So in this case, it's a good thing we were there, or who knows. In other words, we saved the guy, right? What's the evaluation in the one in the book?
And so we both stood up and small laugh. All we saw was 6 whitetails headed the opposite
direction.
But it was
Yeah.
truly fantastic.
Truly a fantastic sight. Yeah. So, so basically what Lobov said was a really good story comprises, a really good natural narrative comprises these, you know. And I mean, Sal is a terrible storyteller. I don't know if you've noticed this, but his stories never do anything, you know, and I'm always saying at the end, like, what's the point in that? You know, what was the point? So I need a coda and or evaluation. Like, he will do the abstract orientation, complicating action and resolution. But then you're like, but why did I just go through all that? What's the point of the story, right? So that is one of the most well-known and consistent kinds of coherence evaluations. But there are others, and this one is a pretty interesting one for you guys. So this is another famous discourse analyst guy called John Wells, and he did the CARS model, creating a research space. And in this case, he's talking about how you apply the CARS model to research article introductions, okay? So what he's saying is within well, we've only got 3 moves. Oh, no, we've got 3 moves, yeah. What he's saying is within the introduction, you would expect in an American English thing to have the author make 3 moves, right? The first one would be to establish the territory, right? So I'm going to talk about, you know, X. So let's say this morning we were with Hilal, right? So she says, I'm talking about OFC, oral corrective feedback, in the second language classroom, right? Then you establish a niche, which usually for us means indicating a gap or adding what is known. So in her case, she was like, there's been a lot done, but nothing's been done in the SLA classroom on smiling, on mitigation of smiling in oral feedback, okay? And then your last move is present. So then you say, so I did a study in which I did this, and then you have these various steps that come inside that last move, all right? So the idea is that if a reader is coming to a American English academic journal article, this is what triggers, right? As you start the paper, this is what the moves that you're looking for, right? So what one of my students did, Hamoud, was compare if these moves were happening in Arabic as articles, similar kinds of articles, and English, okay? So he took a number of articles from education psychology and a number of articles from sociology and looked at the article introductions and specifically coded them for each of these moves. Okay, and what does it look like he found? Anything. Give me something that you're seeing on that.
Well, it's not the same.
It's not the same. Okay. What things are similar?
The first move.
Move 1. Okay, good. It's true that move 1, establishing territory, is not the same, but almost, right? There's a little bit of a dip here in Ed Psych, but basically everybody thinks that's an important move, right? What's one of the real changes?
3.
Right, well, 2 and 3, right? Yeah, sorry, whatever. 2, this is a real difference, right? It turns out that in English, move 2, in both cases, is super important, right? But in Arabic, move 2 can sort of, disappear. And then move 3, presenting the work, also interesting. In English, that's super important. You have to say, here's the gap, and here's what I'm contributing to the gap. But not so in these introductions to Arabic research articles. So what does this, okay, so Jade is looking really like she doesn't believe it.
No, like, I don't know about the Arabic structure, but so what do they do in there?
Well, that's a very good question, and for that I would encourage you to go read my student's dissertation. From 2014 here on campus. It'll be in our library. Basically, my memory is that they didn't do a whole lot. Their introduction was, here's the thing. And they'd have some citations for the thing. But then the rest of the, the important part, interestingly enough, for English ones is this move 2, particularly, which says, here's what I'm going to add. And in many other cultures, it turns out you don't need that move 2. You don't. Now, what happens is that move 2 comes super far at the end. This is what Sal always says about Italian writing. Like, you set it up at the beginning, and then by the time you've got to the end, there's your move 2, because you say, et voila, this is what I found, right? But in American English research tradition, your move 2 has to come right there at the top. Yeah, I'm going to add this to it, right? I'm not going to take you on a journey in which eventually you'll find out what I added to it, right? So that was super interesting, because of course that tells us a lot. What does that tell us about student issues, with writing?
It's like if you have in Arabic learners of English.
Yeah.
So when you're actually grading their writing assignment, you would realize that it's sort of cultural issue, and then what kind of sort of instruction you need to give them.
Yeah, it's true that a lot of the times we just seem to assume that the way we organize information is the way information is supposed to be organized, right? So that we say, why is student X doing that? Who does that? And it's when you start breaking down these kinds of ideas of cross-cultural rhetoric, you get an idea. To me, I will say to a student, yeah, this is great, except for I have no idea what you think you're adding to it. Well, a student from a culture that doesn't do this might say, what do you mean? What am I, isn't that obvious? Or the fact that I'm looking at it, or, so it's super interesting from that perspective. And this comes under the auspices, when it's written discourse, of contrastive rhetoric, which was first proposed by Kaplan in 1966, and considers how different languages may reorganize different paragraph organizations. So, for example, American paragraphs in expository academic writing have a thesis statement at the beginning, right? We'll have a look at that again in a second. Italian and Chinese paragraphs show much more freedom in that position. You have a thesis statement, but it might not appear till the end of the paragraph, right? Yeah, okay. You say sure, Rusi.
Yes. So in Chinese writing, we also have the topic sentence for each paragraph. So we usually put the topic sentence at the very beginning, and again emphasize the key points at the end of the paragraph.
Right.
So, put the topic sentence like at the beginning and at the end.
At the end, okay.
So we do think this kind of structure is the good structure.
It's a good structure.
Yeah,
Oh, okay.
So,
Well, it's interesting because I want you to hold that thought, because the next student we're going to look at looked at Chinese. So
okay.
I want you to see what you. Before we do that, Kaplan's most famous for this, model, and you can see how old this is based on the names. We don't say Oriental or Semitic anymore, thank goodness. So what's interesting here is this assumption. This this assumption that English is straightforward, right? So, and this, of course, is what's caused so much problem with this. But if you look back here, of course, who says it's straightforward? Like, that's the way we do it, but no one says that, that's ABC, right? It just, for us, it's ABC, right? In this tradition of research writing. So, but there's no logical ABC about it, which of course is the problem with all of this. So if you begin with saying that English is the pattern you're demonstrating, expository academic prose in English, and then, I don't even know what to make of these. Rusi, this is supposed to be you. Yeah, you start there and,
Yes, if you want to do something, ask someone to do something, you probably give a lot of reason at the very beginning, and then make the request at the end. So,
right, but this is supposed to be your academic writing.
yes, well, this kind of things in fact both in speaking and writing.
And in writing. Okay,
Yes.
okay. Fascinatingly, it's unclear to me and to many other people, what this is supposed to be. And even more what this is supposed to be, the Russian. So, Kaplan's doodles, if you didn't know, have come under a lot of criticism, and you can go onto Google Scholar anytime you want and say criticism of Kaplan, contrastive rhetoric, and you can read all about it. But and of course it's true, because if you have this as your underlying assumption, then everything else is wrong, right? So that's not my point. My point is that right back in 1966, it's when we first had this idea that it was going to be different. Now, what's happened to the world since then is that academic writing in English has become the sort of baseline norm for many, many academic subjects, right? So now you're sort of stuck in one mode, whatever it is that seems to be the norm for that one. But we should be clear that that's not because it's the best, right? It's because English is so dominant, right? That it is what it is. But when we look back at something like this, that doesn't have some kind of inherent logic of its own that's more logical than somebody else's, right? I just, as I say, it's the hegemony. So what this dissertation, this was one that Sao did with a Taiwanese student. And what she did was take a corpus of 120 articles, so 60 in American English and 60 in Taiwanese Chinese, in similar disciplines and time frames. And she extracted 5 paragraphs from the articles for a total of 600 paragraphs, right? Because she had to sort of, you couldn't do the whole thing or she'd have been there till she died, right? So, and then she broke down each of the paragraphs and said, what happens with thesis placement? So have a look at that and tell me what you think you see.
So for English, you usually have the topic sentence for at the very beginning.
Yeah, the thesis placement is like, I mean, you've got a teeny tiny bit there and maybe like, you know, a smidge here, but essentially everything is consistently at the beginning. But what's happening with the Chinese?
Jesus says more in the second.
Yeah, it's more like what Rusi just said, right? That it could be at the front, but then it could come right at the back again too. Or and sometimes, you know, it was much more variable. So this is what the results were. Over 97% had their thesis in the first sentence, and then, you know, not dissimilar to what you were suggesting, that half the people have it in the first sentence, and then there was sort of 1%.
For English.
Oh yes, sorry, for English, 1% have it in the last sentence, whereas in Chinese, nearly 25% have it in the last sentence. Yeah. So again, this sort of picture tells you that if you've got students working in discourse text. So last, you know, TESOL Quarterly, right? The journal TESOL Quarterly. So it's the biggest journal in our research journal in our field. And I was on the board some years ago. I'm about to go back on the board again. And when I was on the board, we looked at the people that were getting published in TQ, and it was almost exclusively traditional English speakers, almost exclusively from traditional English backgrounds, including America, UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Then, interestingly, the next one, and it was teeny tiny compared to something like this and this compared to, you know, was in fact non-native varieties, so emerging varieties. So people who we could track to Chinese universities or Korean university. And the ones that were the least represented were the new varieties of English. African Englishes, Indian Englishes, Asian Englishes. And my theory at the time was because for non-native speakers from emerging Englishes like Rusi or Jade or Nana, you can understand that the way you do it in your language might be different from the way, right? So you have to retrain. Right? It might be super annoying and you might say, why do I have to do this? But you know, if you want to get published in an American journal, you're going to have to retrain to do that. And I think the problem with outer circle Englishes is they, or what I've called new varieties, is that they see themselves as writing in English. So it's like, what do you want me to do that I don't do? So that year it was with Suresh Kanagaraja, and he started a mentoring program that I did, in which he would identify, as editor of TQ, he would identify an article that he thought was super good, but written by either a new or emerging variety of English, and they were really struggling with the reviewers' comments. So it wasn't that they couldn't necessarily make the changes, it was that they couldn't really understand what it was that the reviewers wanted, right? Because their mindset is so completely different, right? So reviewers have a tendency to say things like, well, of course, that doesn't make sense, you know, and they're like, well, of course, why? Why, of course, you know, what is it that, you know, so I was very proud that at the end of that year, when we looked at the chart, there was one Malaysian English author published in TQ, and that was the author that I had worked with under Suresh's program to say, here's how you interpret reviews. So I wasn't rewriting it for him or anything, I was just saying, here's what they're trying to say to you. Think about it in that sort of way. And after several rewrites, he got it in there. So it's of course another issue. The hegemony in journals in applied linguistics is really appalling, considering we're in applied linguistics and cross-cultural studies. That's another issue, and one that's consistently problematic, and that a number of people have looked at and problematized. And again, that literature is all out there if you're interested in that. But what this kind of research shows us is one of the reasons why, you know, that if we're not willing to expand our notion of what coherent discourse is, this is what's going to happen every time. And we're not willing to. We're English dominant, and we're, in my view, we're not willing to. So, yeah. Any questions or comments?
So, like, that Suresh Kanagaraja, he's a non-native speaker, right? Like,
he's no. He's speaker of he's Tamil. So yeah, he's from, where are the Tamils? Oh my God, I can't believe I can't remember. This is outrageous. Yeah, so he's Tamil. So he grew up speaking English and Sri Lanka. Thank you very much. Oh my God. So he grew up speaking English and a dialect, a language dialect at home. But yeah, he was completely. But he, you know, first of all, remade himself the way that the British Council wanted, and then took a look in the mirror and said, why am I remaking myself? And has now become somebody who is very sensitive to those concerns of, like, you know, should you have to remake yourself, you know? And one of the reasons that his current interests, for example, one of his current interests is translanguaging, this idea of how many codes you can mesh together in different ways to create your message. And that's, of course, part of this whole concern. You know, it's sort of saying that, you know, you don't have to be, you know, you can be a mutt dog, you know, you can put a bunch of different things together. You don't have to be a special breed dog, you know. And the more that we are accepting of that, you know, the more rich our stuff will be. But right now, the publishing in America is not accepting of that at all. I mean, you know, that goes without saying.
Like, you have to start like copying what the American style
Yeah.
is, and then when you become like a famous
You
figure,
become like.
you can actually.
Yeah, when you become Suresh Kanagaraja, you can tell everybody where to go. This is true. This is true, but not many of us are going to end up becoming like Suresh Kanagaraja, I can tell you that. But yes, that's absolutely right. I mean, you know, it depends how bad you want in. I mean, if you want in, then you've got to, you know,
Yeah.
right. And yeah, but it's important for us to do this kind of analysis to say there's nothing special about that conforming stuff. I mean, you have to, but it's not because it is the most logical or it is the best thing to do or anything like that. It's the dominant style, right? So I think that's a sort of important point, particularly for us as teachers, to really interrogate what our students are doing and saying, you know, where is this coming from? Not just do this, you know, but let's talk about structure and let's talk about style and those differences. Yeah. So finally, what she said was that Chinese and English differ in regard to placement. English paragraphs overwhelmingly place thesis in first sentence. Chinese paragraph, much greater variation. In Chinese, the thesis appears most frequently in first, but the second most frequent position is last, which is what Ruchi said. A non-indifferent number show thesis in second, third, and fourth. So in other words, there's a lot more variability possible in that structure than there is for us. Okay, so that's written, coherence and cohesion. And now we're going to go back and have a look at spoken coherence and paragraphs. So this was a cohesive device that we spent some time looking at last week. Can you look at the example and tell me what's wrong with the...
Sounds aggressive.
Why? What's happening?
It's almost like when does the train leaves at 7.
Well, think about it. What's happening? What's happening?
Extra repetition is just.
It's what that non-native speaker was doing. It's extra repetition of stuff you know already. It's not just aggressive, it's super annoying, right? When does the train leave? The train leaves at 7. Can you give me a ride to the station? Yes, I can give you a ride to the station, right? So this is exactly what was happening with the non-native speaker in Ondi stuff, that there's good repetition and bad repetition. And if you are repeating these things that we know that you're not going to repeat, then the listener doesn't just ignore it. The listener says, why are you doing that? Like, why are you doing this thing that I am not expecting you to do? There must be a reason why. So are you being aggressive, or are you doing this, or are you doing that? Yeah. But then, of course, we do have, this is another set of repetitions. What's different? This is fine, right? And why is this fine?
The context is first different, and also the topic is less serious, and it's sort of like they're gossiping or some things, and then the speaker A expects the speaker B to agree, and then what the speaker B is doing is like repeating what he's saying in order to express agreement. Yeah.
Right. So in this case, it's weird because that doesn't do anything except for confuse you, right? In this case, that's exactly what it's functioning as. It's functioning as agreement through convergence. In this case, lexical convergence. So it seemed weird to me. Oh yeah, totally weird, right? So that is lexical convergence. So what you're doing is saying, yeah, I agree with you. I really agree with you. In fact, I'm going to take your, use your word too. Do you think he's crazy? Maybe. I'm not entirely sure what crazy looks like, right? But definitely weird, right? So this is exactly the difference. In this case, you've got lexical convergence to heighten social convergence together. Maybe they're gossiping or something else, but what it does is make you closer together, right? So this was this is the thing that Andy was trying to show, right? That it's not just straight up and down repetition. It depends on what the. Now, if you add coherence, coherence is this broader frame, right? So your book does it with conversation, right? So if you look at 136 and 137, your book is saying, this is the structure of a conversation, right? This is what happens in conversations. That a coherent conversation is one that has these features. It will have a greeting, and you're looking at these in your ritual constraints, right? It will have a greeting and a leave taking if you're going to do the beginning and the end, right? It has a topic development. It has a turn taking structure, right? And that is the organizational elements of it. And then what your book does, which is quite nice actually, is look at the questions for discourse analysis. So if you look, for example, at number 2, overwhelmingly, the rule is that one party talks at a time, okay? So then the discourse analysis question, and something that you can, you'll be looking at with your ritual constraints, is what happens when more than one person talks at once? What do overlap mean? What does it accomplish? So what does tend to happen if we overlap?
Depends on the context. In my context, it's like it shows that you are actually super engaged in the conversation.
Good, yes.
Here, it shows impoliteness.
Right. So depending upon the context of the conversation, it might show that you're like, yeah, I'm super interested. But if it's a sort of mistake overlap, what tends to happen?
It's viewed as interaction.
Well, what does one person do? There's 2 of you talking at the same time. One drops out, right? One drops out. And it gets, so, you might make a face or something because you're trying to show everybody else, I've just been interrupted, but you drop out, okay? So the super aggressive thing to do is what?
Keep talking.
Keep on talking.
Louder,
right? And you talk over, right? Which I have done a number of times, apparently. I'm not a very nice conversationalist. And, and that really sends a very strong message, right? Of, and so here, number 3, occurrences are common but brief. Right? What causes them to be brief? Well, because what people will do to avoid talking is someone will drop. Yeah. So it's sort of interesting. Is it always the same person that drops? If you look at anecdotal discussion of mansplaining, for example, many women will say it's always them that drop, and that the man just keeps on trucking, right? I mean, that is totally an empirical question, and there's quite a lot on gender and conversation if you guys are interested in that kind of thing. Is your perception, those of you that are second language speakers, is your perception that this is very similar in Farsi and in Chinese and Arabic?
It's very different in my native Akan language.
In Akan.
People just keep talking louder, and so when 2 families are having conversation, you might think they're arguing, but it's just the way the conversation goes. We'll just keep talking till the louder one takes over.
Oh, it's funny you should say that, because Fofo said something similar.
Yeah.
She said that you just keep on trucking. Just keep on talking. Yeah. What about you guys?
No, like the same, like somebody like just drops.
Somebody drops. Yeah, same. Yeah, same. Yeah. Turn order, for example. How do speakers in a group select who to speak next? How does that work in English?
Like
Pause.
saying you, like
Yeah, but if you look at where it says turn allocation techniques on 12, yeah, but if we're talking about self-selecting,
Sometimes like a pause or something.
yeah, but who self-selects first?
The one who takes the turn in talking.
Yeah, and who does that tend to be? I love the way you're like, what is she after? Power, right?
Power,
Yeah. So again with the men, not necessarily, but yeah. So it's a power issue. In English, it's a power issue. Like you're allowed to self-select if you're the more powerful person in the interaction. If you're the least powerful person in the interaction, it's harder to self-select. So one place that you can see this is, for example, doctor-patient conversation, where doctors will self-select, and patients, if they try and self-select, are often stopped, right? Which is one of the reasons I realize when I go into a doctor's office, immediately they walk in the door and say hello, and I say hello. Then I launch into like really loud, like, I am here because, like, in order to say what it is I want to say. Because if I wait and the doctor and she says, so, what are you here for? And then I say something and then she immediately starts, then I can't get all of it out, right? So, this just happened to me, too much information, I'm sure, but basically my teeth are completely awful. And many British teeth are like this, apparently. But at this point, I have 3 separate dental professionals, a regular dentist, a periodontist, and now, God help me, an orthodontist, because I'm going to have braces. And when I met the orthodontist for the first time last week, I have had periodontal surgeries and trouble, which is pretty nasty, basically, since 1999. So before he did anything to me or thought about doing anything to me, I wanted him to know the history of my teeth, right? Because I didn't want him to then try and do something that was going to basically make all my teeth fall out of my mouth, right? So he's like, hi, I'm Dr. Miller. I'm like, hi, nice to meet you, Dr. Miller. Let me tell you about my teeth. And the poor guy just sat there while I was just like, and then in 1999 I had this, and then in 2004 I had this, and then I had this, and then I had this. So my teeth are not, these are my teeth. Anyway, yeah, it was very funny. And I realized I was doing it because I was worried. I didn't know him, and I was worried that he wouldn't let me self-select later down the line. So power is very important. I don't know about your languages. Is it
it's
power?
Very different. Like,
it's very different.
Went to back home when I went for my eye surgery because I used to wear glasses. The doctor actually wanted to do the surgery because I had some minor incident before the surgery, and I was telling him, and he was just interrupting me all the time. I was like, yeah, I know. Don't worry, I know. I was like, let me talk.
Yeah.
Let me talk. Then in America, I went to an American doctor. He was just all listening to me. And I said all the stories, and he was just like, yeah, interesting. Oh, that's why. And then a month ago, I went to another doctor who was Indian, and I started talking. And then when when his turn actually started, he didn't let me take any other turn. I was completely was talking for 20 minutes. I was like, that's the longest time I listened to a doctor.
Right. So this is fascinating, Jay, because that's all the various possibilities, exactly. Right? And my nightmare is being shut up, right? It's being told,
Yeah, I was like,
oh, I know that. And I'm like, no, you don't know me. You don't know my problems. Yeah. So, yeah, it's true. It's true.
I want to hit him so bad.
I know. Well, so you see this, so it's sort of fascinating. I mean, it's a shame that we never have our recording devices when we really want them, because That would be an awesome, you know. Yeah. So one thing I like about this, and I encourage you to read it as carefully as you can, because it will also help you with your ritual constraints paper, is the fact that she puts these questions for discourse analysis next to it. So it makes you think about what it is that you want to, how do people select, how do people determine when a turn has gone on long enough? Like if you have a sense of somebody, you know, what is it that people tend to do? You know, they will often sort of try and extend a feedback. So they might say, yeah, you know, and then try and get the person to shut up that way, you know. So in other words, you're recognizing with the feedback, but then you're saying now it's somebody else's turn. It's sort of fascinating. And the other interesting thing is children. Yeah, I mean, children just have not got a clue from about 0 to about 6 as to what it is they're supposed to. And then they start acting more like adults around about 5 or 6. But further, like they will have terribly long turn delays, for example. You'll ask them a question and they're just like, you know, they're off with the fairies. And you're like, did you hear the question? And, you know, you got nothing. Or, you know, they have to be taught by their parents how to interrupt, right? Because you'll be talking to their parents. They'll be like, mommy, you know, and it's like, wait till mommy's finished talking to Aunt Lucy, right? And then you can see the kid is like, well, how am I supposed to know when that is, right? So it's wonderful. It's so children, if you're interested in conversational turns as part of your data analysis, children are an awesome way to show you what underlying rules we have. Good. Yeah. Mimi.
A comment with the lexical convergence thing, because from my personal experience in Ghana is that most people would not say, oh yeah, that's totally weird. They would first object to what you're saying to agree. So for example, Jade might say, oh, I think Nana is really pretty. And I say, no, she's stunning.
Oh, right.
She's really pretty. I say, no, she's stunning.
Yeah, right.
Initially, when I first moved here, I would object to do that, and people would back off, like, because it's very uncommon to object to someone else's statement first to agree.
It's true. It's true that we expect convergence. Yeah, and that is not. So, and of course, because speaking is so quick, we've talked about this before, the alarm bells go off before they've, you know. Plus, the other thing is, other adults don't like to be told no. Yeah. As soon as you say, even if you are in fact agreeing with them, because you say, no, she's stunning, they don't like that way of putting it out there. You know, it makes them feel, I mean, because we will use no with children and with animals. So it makes them feel a bit like you're taking the power, you know. Power differentials are very, I talk about it quite a lot, but they're, it doesn't have to be power like, you know, oh my God, he's the doctor. And it can be just someone asks you for directions. At that point, you hold the power in that conversation because you're the one that has the directions that this person needs, right? So that power differential can shift around, but it's always somewhere, right? And it's sort of more or less salient depending upon the context, but it's always shifting around, right?
It explains a lot where I was stepping on some people's toes without noticing that I was, and people just didn't like to converse with me very much.
Oh, me.
Later, I was like, oh, that's what I'm doing wrong.
Yeah, no, it is interesting because the other thing, of course, with all these things, and the reason that she puts all these discourse analysis questions is we don't think about this at all. It just sort of happens, right? Because these ritual constraints, as Goffman has called them, are so inherent you know, we just don't think about them. It just seems like the norm for us, right? So one of the ways in which spoken texts hold together is by this idea of paratones that are essentially the analogous to a written paragraph. So what you're looking at here is speech, and this is 4 separate utterances that are part of one full text. Okay, so this is 4 separate utterances that make up a coherent text. And one thing that happens, actually, sorry, that's not true, because I'm just about to make things really complicated for you. It's 3 utterances that make a coherent text, and then a new utterance here. Sorry, that's my bad. So what you see here is that you start with this very high level pitch, and then in the middle utterance it goes down, and then in the last utterance it goes all the way down. And then for the new utterance, it resets back high again. So this idea of high, mid, low within one paragraph is the same idea of coherence within sentences, essentially in writing. And that when you're ready to do a new paragraph, you reset your pitch. So I'm going to have you listen to the wonderful Mark Hazlitt. How many of you know Mark? Yeah, so Mark is the KER guy at our radio station who let me use his talent to record and show you what this would look like. So in this case, it's 4 paragraphs, and what you'll see is a slightly exaggerated version, but not too much, of what happens when we do paragraphs. So in this case, he starts with a high, and then by the end of that paragraph, he finishes low. Then he resets, finishes low, resets, and then you'll hear him do a last reset for the last thing.
Look at the competition. Our main competitor, Benton, entered the market 10 years later than us, but since then, they have grown more rapidly and are now the biggest in terms of market share. Why? Their products are better, sold at lower prices, and presented more attractively. Now, our second major competitor is Zekron. They entered the market at the same time as us. They have a lower market share than us, and their products are sold at slightly higher prices. However, their annual return shows greater productivity. The last major competitor is Mansell. They have a much smaller market share, but their products are sold at the top end of the market at much higher prices. As a result, they achieve the best profitability of the 4 companies with a much lower turnover. So, what can we say about our own position?
You hear that? Yeah. So one of the things we know about creating coherent monologic text is that the more we can use these kind of pitch effects, the more coherent the text appears to the listener, because the listener doesn't know what they're listening for, but is in fact listening for these pitch resets, so these ends of information, and then pitch resets that show new information. And often what we do is we mark it with a multiplicity of cues, right? We talked about the fact that discourse has a lot of redundant cues. So we might say first, okay, and then we'll have it. So in his case, he's got now and so, but then you listen, da, 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 and then you don't realize, but what you're listening for is second, right? And we know when we look at some research on student writing, that note-taking, that if the lecturer says number one, we're going to do da 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 da, when they think that the lecturer is done with that point, they'll write a 2 before the lecturer even says to. So if the lecturer suddenly drops that organizational ball and you have no idea whether you're still listening to point 2 or you've moved on to point 3, this is one of the reasons when students start getting really confused. It's one of the things that causes listener irritation, because now you're like, okay, I thought I was following this. I had an organizational structure. It was being cued multiply, by the lexical item 1 or so, or now the pitch reset. So I'm real clear on what's going on. But if those things kind of fade away, then the organization starts getting less clear. So what we did, and I've uploaded this reading for you as an optional reading in week 8. John Levis and I decided to see if you read something as a text, was this really happening? Or if you split it into utterances, was there some compression? So we had the same text, and the pitch onsets are marked here. So it was something like, last time I was at an airport, something happened, you know. It was funny. This went on and on and on, right? So what we were looking, so then they either read it as a narrative, as the whole read aloud story, or they read a bunch of sentences in which these appeared, but it wasn't a narrative. And the reason we were doing it was because our contention was, if you only gave students utterance level practice, you were contributing to pitch range compression, okay? So if your students never were really practicing spoken text, you know, if you were only have them speaking in single utterances or giving you single responses, but you were never having them tell a story or, you know, make a speech or whatever, then this would contribute to their pitch compression. And you can see that that's what we found, right? So what you're looking at is here. So when it's read as a text, she goes up to 363 hertz, okay? Average for a chick is about 320, 30, something like that. So it's nice and high. But when she says it as just a list of sentences, it's a normal range, right? You don't get this high pitch onset that we would expect to have at the beginning. And you can see that this goes on and on, right? Every time what you get is a compressed range, right? So for men, the normal one is probably about 130, 40, something like that. So now you've got a very high pitch onset when it's the beginning of the text, right? But when he reads it as a sentence, we don't. So that was one of our, and the reason we did it was because we were arguing that you needed to give students opportunity to do these larger spoken texts in order for them to be able to understand and produce patterns like this. Okay. Did you guys, when you were learning English, do much discourse level? Was it a lot of utterances? Discourse?
Stories, a lot of stories.
You did do a lot of stories? Oh, that's good. That's good. No. Yeah.
Don't feel like I learned like through structuralism.
Right. So that would be lots of utterances, right? Yeah. Lots of single utterances. Yeah. So Then the last one, I didn't include this because it's a book chapter and it's super annoying to PDF, but if anybody wants to, I'm sure Nana will be delighted to PDF it as part of her work as the lab manager. But in 2008, with Pat Bird, we were very interested, again, as part of this Students in Discourse, what is it that students heard versus what it is that they read. So in other words, why were undergraduate students, particularly in this case it was undergraduate students, having so much trouble even if they read the reading before the lecture? You know, so let's say it's a history lecture and they've read the reading, right? They haven't gone in there with nothing. But still, when they get in there, they can't get it. Okay, they're making a mess of their notes. We saw their notes. They were terrible. They had no organizational structure. They couldn't seem to work out what was happening orally and how that compared to what they had read in the textbook, right? So one thing that we suggested was that texts for second language learners, especially reading and writing text, usually provide more opportunity for learning discourse markers necessary for the comprehension of written discourse. What is lacking is the same opportunity for learning spoken discourse markers. So in other words, it was very common in the textbook to say, in addition, however, furthermore, right? And slowly over time you learn that this means this and this means, you know. But that's not what tends to happen inside spontaneous lectures. Okay, we don't tend to say, in addition, right? We might use it some other way. So what's happening is the learners are not listening for the organization. They don't recognize the organizational markers when they come, right? So that's what we did, was look at markers in for structural boundaries in writing and in speaking. So in speaking, we use my case, which is the Michigan Spoken Academic Corpus. And for writing, we used AWL, the Academic Word List. And we investigated what's called lexical bundles in corpus research, a sequence of 3 or more words that co-occur frequently in a particular register. So lexical phrases, formulas, prefab expressions, and so on. And what we found was that inside AWL, so inside the academic work list, you had all these things like, you know, boundary markers of however, in addition, and so on. But inside the spoken lectures, you had these other boundary markers, like, I don't know, I mean, I think, you know what I mean? You know what I'm saying? So that meant I'm ending this structural boundary. So you know what I mean? Right, okay, now we're moving on to something else. And that the students weren't recognizing this, the second language, as a structural boundary, right? Because they're listening for written language structural boundaries, right? So it was super interesting because none of these things appeared in the AWL, for example. But they were replete throughout the spoken lectures as organizational markers. Another one would be, right? So you get it? You know, and that actually often is not actually saying, do you get it, right? There's no gap for you to say, yes, I do. I mean, if you're nice, like you guys are, you're nodding your head. So you sort of, but actually the speaker is using it as a structural boundary to say, okay, moving on. We're going to do such and such. So you have to recognize that that's what a structural boundary looks like in a lecture as opposed to in the reading. And it was super interesting to see that this difference. So again, this was something as teachers, we thought, okay, this is something that we need to do for our students who have to listen to lectures. So we would pick out examples from my case that were particularly full of these kind of structural boundary markings. You know, everything's transcribed in my case, so you can just go and listen to some and pick some out. And then that's the work that we would do with the students in class to say, this is the kind of thing that you're listening for. And for many students, it was a real eye-opener, because for some, you know, they had, even though they understand the difference between spoken and written modality, they didn't realize how that was going to be manifest, you know. So they didn't realize what they were trying to listen for. So it was super interesting. Plus, in addition, you're listening for, of course, pitch markers. So, you know, you might get a lexical marker like now, or you might not, but you get a high pitch reset, right? So those are the kind of things that we were working with them on. All right. So, any questions or comments about any of that? Make sense? Yeah. Anything from the book that didn't make sense in the chapter? Okay, so again, I encourage you to go back and have a look at that conversation one, because the kinds of questions that she's talking about there will help you, are the kinds of questions that you can look at for your data analysis. They'll help you with that ritual constraint. So for this week's reading post, because I know your second data analysis is due and you're all going to be like up to your eyes doing it, I'm sort of giving you a fairly low bar. Okay, I need you to do something, but I want you to think about how you might use discourse analysis, or might have used it in the past, in the teaching and learning of writing. So the stuff that I was just talking about with the writing, but why does writing that has been edited always sound more coherent, do you think, as opposed to writing that has not been edited? So have a think about it. Write me a short, you know, little thing of your own opinion, and then move on and do your data analysis. So there's not any extra reading or anything like that, okay? Yeah? All right, we are done.